The 17th of August, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. Oberst Klaus Richter stood on the observation platform of the Luftwaffe command post, his binoculars trembling in his weathered hands. At 42 years old, he was a veteran of both wars, a fighter pilot who had earned the Iron Cross in the trenches of 1918, and now a senior air defense coordinator watching the skies over the Reich's industrial heartland. The morning had begun like any other. Coffee ersatz, bitter and thin. Reports from the night shift. Weather conditions, clear. Visibility, excellent. Too excellent, as it would turn out. At 0947 hours, the telephone erupted. The voice on the other end belonged to a young radar operator, and Klaus could hear the panic barely contained beneath his professional tone. "Oberst, we have contacts. Many contacts." "How many?" Klaus asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer would change everything. A pause, static on the line. Then, "Sir, the scope, it's white. We've stopped counting at 200. They're still coming." Klaus set down the receiver with deliberate calm, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He'd flown combat missions where death brushed past his cockpit. He'd seen friends spiral down in flames. But this was different. This was the future arriving like a judgment. He climbed the steel ladder to the highest observation point, emerging into the brilliant August sunshine. To the west, the sky should have been an endless blue canvas. Instead, what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The horizon was disappearing. A dark mass was forming there, like a thunderstorm being born in reverse, growing from small to massive, from distant to inevitable. But these weren't clouds. Through his binoculars, Klaus could make out the individual shapes now. B-17. Flying fortresses. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Flying in perfect combat box formations, each one bristling with machine guns, each one carrying tons of high explosive meant for the ball-bearing factories below. "Mein Gott," whispered Lieutenant Fischer beside him, a young officer who had never seen the American heavy bombers in such force. It's the entire American Air Force. But Klaus knew better. This wasn't their entire force. This was just one mission, one day. And if they could do this now, what would tomorrow bring? What about next week? Next month? He'd read the intelligence reports that others dismissed as Allied propaganda. America was building 5,000 aircraft per month. 5,000. Germany was producing hundreds. The mathematics were simple and merciless. The drone reached them, now a sound unlike anything Klaus had experienced in 2 decades of warfare. Not the individual engines of attacking aircraft, but a collective rumble that vibrated in his chest, a mechanical thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of industrial might converted into airborne apocalypse. "Sound the alarm," Klaus ordered, his voice steady despite the dread pooling in his stomach. "Scramble every fighter within 50 kilometers. Contact flak batteries from here to Frankfurt. And Fischer?" "Yes, Oberst? Make sure the civilians are in the shelters. All of them." As Fischer ran to execute the orders, Klaus remained transfixed by the approaching armada. The formations were so precise, so professional. Each group of bombers flew in staggered altitudes, high squadron, lead squadron, low squadron, creating interlocking fields of defensive fire. Their contrails were beginning to streak the perfect sky like chalk marks on a schoolroom slate, parallel lines that testified to American discipline and training. He thought of his own pilots, brave men, skilled men, but exhausted from months of constant combat. They flew Me 109 seconds and W 190 seconds. That were magnificent machines. But they were outnumbered. And the B-17 seconds didn't need to outfight them. They just needed to survive long enough to drop their bombs. The first fighters were scrambling now. Klaus could hear the Daimler-Benz engines roaring to life across the airfield below. Within minutes, 12 fighters were airborne. Tiny specks of defiance, climbing toward the bomber stream. Through his binoculars, Klaus watched the aerial battle unfold with the detached precision of a man counting the seconds of his own execution. The German fighters dove into the formations with desperate courage, their cannon shells sparkling as they struck home. Here and there, a B-17 would falter, smoking, falling away from its formation. But for every bomber that fell, the Americans sent up a wall of machine gun fire that seemed to fill the sky. One of his fighters, Klaus, thought it might be young Hartmann, staggered as tracers walked across his wing, then spiraled down, trailing black smoke. The bombers pressed on. Inexorably. Mechanical. Unstoppable. Klaus did the calculation in his head. If each B-17 carried a typical bomb load of 4,000 pounds, and there were, he counted formations, estimated numbers at least 250 bombers, 1 million pounds of explosives were about to fall on Schweinfurt. 1 million pounds. On a city of 50,000 people. On factories that produced 60% of Germany's ball bearings. He'd defended the Reich for 4 years now. He'd watched the tide turn at Stalingrad. He'd seen the Afrika Korps pushed into the sea. He'd tracked the Allied invasion of Sicily. But this moment of watching the sky turn black with enemy bombers, while his few remaining fighters buzzed around them like insects attacking an elephant. This was the moment Klaus Richter knew the war was lost. Not next year, not after some theoretical wonder weapon. It was over now, in the late summer of 1943, though the dying would continue for nearly 2 more years. The bomb bay doors were opening. "Take cover!" someone was shouting. "Bombs falling!" Klaus remained where he stood, watching through his binoculars as the first bombs tumbled free, black eggs tumbling in lazy parabolas toward the earth. He tracked them almost academically, noting their descent, calculating impact points. The first explosion came from the factory district, a flash of orange and white that bloomed upward, followed seconds later by the deep crump of detonation that he felt in his bones. Then another, and another. The explosions merged into a continuous roar as thousands of bombs found their targets, churning the city below into fire and rubble. The observation post shook. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Someone was pulling at Klaus's arm, trying to drag him to the shelter, but he shook them off. He needed to witness this. Someone had to see it clearly, without flinching, without the comfortable lies that would surely follow. The bombing continued for 17 minutes by Klaus's watch. 17 minutes of apocalypse. When the last bomber finally passed overhead and turned for home, trailing its own wounded and dead, Schweinfurt was burning from one end to the other. Klaus lowered his binoculars slowly. In the silence that followed that strange, ringing silence after sustained bombardment, he could hear crying from somewhere below. The all-clear sirens began their mournful wail. Lieutenant Fischer appeared at his elbow, pale and shaking. "Oberst, preliminary reports estimate 40% of the ball-bearing production destroyed. Casualties among the workers. Very high." Klaus nodded slowly. He should feel something: rage, grief, defiance. Instead, he felt only a cold clarity. "And tomorrow, Lieutenant? What happens tomorrow when they come back? And the day after that?" Fischer had no answer. Because there was no answer. Germany could replace neither the factories, nor the men, nor the fighters fast enough. The Americans would return. Again and again. With more bombers, more fighters, more bombs. An avalanche of industrial production that would bury the Reich beneath high explosive and incendiary. As Klaus climbed down from the observation platform, his legs unsteady on the ladder, he made a decision. Tonight, he would write a letter to his wife and daughter, not the usual careful lines approved by censors, but the truth. He would tell them to leave Berlin, to go to his wife's family farm in Bavaria, far from the cities and factories that would soon be systematically destroyed from the air. Because Klaus Richter had seen the future that morning. It flew in perfect formation at 25,000 feet, and it was relentless, mechanical, and utterly without mercy. The war wasn't over, but its conclusion had been written in the sky over Schweinfurt by hundreds of B-17 seconds flying westward toward home, already planning their return. The 6th of September, 1943. 3 weeks later, Klaus Richter hadn't slept properly since Schweinfurt. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the formations again. Perfect, mechanical, unstoppable. The nightmares weren't of death or fire. They were of mathematics, cold equations that added up to only one conclusion. He sat in the officers' mess, picking at a breakfast of black bread and synthetic jam, when Oberst Friedrich Kramer dropped into the chair across from him. Kramer commanded the fighter wing that had intercepted the Americans over Schweinfurt. His face had aged a decade in 3 weeks. "They're coming back," Kramer said without preamble, his voice hollow. "Intelligence reports another major raid forming, maybe bigger than the last one." Klaus set down his coffee. "When? Could be today. Could be tomorrow. Does it matter?" Kramer's laugh was bitter.
"We lost 18 pilots at Schweinfurt, Klaus. 18 of my best men. Do you know how many Americans we shot down?"
36 bombers, Klaus replied. He'd memorized every detail of that day, plus 14 fighters, 50 aircraft. Kramer leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "And you know what the intelligence reports say? The Americans built 500 aircraft in the time it took us to shoot down those 50. We're bailing out the ocean with a teaspoon." Klaus glanced around the mess hall. Such talk was dangerous. Defeatism could get you sent to a punishment battalion, or worse. But Kramer wasn't wrong. The numbers were there for anyone brave enough to look at them honestly. "We continue fighting," Klaus said carefully. "What else can we do? You can stop lying to yourself." Kramer stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I watch boys 19, 20 years old climb into cockpits knowing they probably won't come back. And for what? To delay the inevitable by a few weeks? A few months?" Before Klaus could respond, the air raid sirens began their rising wail. They came. This time, Klaus watched from a different vantage point. A bunker on the outskirts of Stuttgart, where he'd been reassigned to coordinate defenses for the industrial Ruhr Valley. Through the bunker's observation slit, he counted the formations as they appeared over the horizon. More than last time. At least 300 bombers, maybe more, escorted now by long-range P-47 Thunderbolt fighters that could protect them deep into German territory. The Americans were learning, adapting, improving. Meanwhile, Germany was running out of fuel, running out of pilots, running out of time. The young radar operator beside him, a teenager named Weber who should have been in university, was providing running commentary with practiced efficiency. Second wave, approaching from the southwest. Fighter interception in progress. Flak batteries engaging. Klaus watched his fighters rise to meet the threat. They dove through the bomber formations with suicidal courage, and for a few moments, the sky filled with tracers and explosions. 3 bombers fell, trailing fire. Then 4. But more kept coming. And one by one, his fighters were either shot down or forced to break off, their ammunition exhausted. The bombs fell on Stuttgart with industrial precision. Klaus watched the city's factories disappear beneath mushrooming explosions. 12 minutes of bombing. When it ended, a third of Stuttgart's industrial capacity was gone, along with hundreds, maybe thousands of civilian workers who'd been trapped in inadequate shelters. That night, Klaus did something he'd been considering for weeks. He went to see General Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, a senior Luftwaffe officer who'd been his mentor during the previous war. Hoffmann was 63, too old for combat commands, but still influential in headquarters. If anyone would listen to reason, it would be him. He found Hoffmann in his office, studying maps that showed the increasing devastation of Germany's cities. The old man looked up when Klaus entered and gestured to a chair. "You look like hell, Klaus." "I feel like hell, sir." Klaus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I need to speak frankly. What I say, it may be considered defeatist." Hoffmann's expression didn't change. "Close the door," Klaus did, then returned to his seat. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Klaus said, "We can't win this war. Not anymore. Probably not for the last year, but certainly not after what I've seen in the past month. Go on. The Americans are producing aircraft faster than we can shoot them down. Much faster. They're training pilots faster than we can kill them. And every day, they're getting better longer-range escorts, improved tactics, better coordination. Meanwhile, we're down to teenage pilots with 20 hours of training, flying on ersatz fuel, with ammunition that we can barely produce because our factories keep getting bombed. Klaus leaned forward. Sir, I've run the numbers. It's not a question of if we lose. It's only a question of how many more cities get destroyed before we admit it. Hoffman was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Read this. But before you do, understand that if you repeat anything in this document, we'll both be shot. Klaus opened the folder. Inside were intelligence assessments, production figures, casualty reports, all marked most secret. As he read, his hands began to shake. The reality was even worse than he'd calculated. Germany was producing 1,500 aircraft per month. America and Britain combined were producing 8,000. German oil production was collapsing under bombing. The Eastern Front was consuming men and material at an unsustainable rate. And perhaps most damning, Germany had no strategic reserves left. Every fighter, every pilot, every gallon of fuel was already committed. How long have you known? Klaus asked quietly. Since Stalingrad. Hoffman took the folder back, locked it away. Maybe before, but after Stalingrad, anyone with eyes could see it. Then why do we continue? Because the alternative is worse. Hoffman's voice was heavy with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. What do you think happens if we surrender tomorrow, Klaus? You think the Soviets will be merciful after what we did in Russia? You think the Americans will forgive the camps, the executions, the occupied territories? He shook his head. No. We fight because stopping would mean complete destruction. At least this way, we buy time. Maybe for a miracle. Probably just for more dying. Klaus left Hoffman's office feeling even more hollow than when he'd entered. There would be no miracle, no wonder weapon that would turn the tide, no diplomatic solution. Just more raids, more deaths, more cities burning, until there was nothing left to bomb. Over the next weeks, Klaus watched the pattern repeat with mechanical regularity. The Americans would come sometimes to Munich, sometimes to Frankfurt, sometimes back to Schweinfurt. The British would bomb by night, turning entire city centers into infernos. His fighters would rise to meet them, would shoot down a few, would lose more than they killed. The math never changed. He began documenting everything in a private journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his quarters. Not for the Reich, not for history, but for his daughter, so that someday she might understand what he'd witnessed. The end of a nation, written in contrails and bomb damage assessments. On the 14th of October 1943, the Americans returned to Schweinfurt in force. Klaus coordinated the defense from his bunker, watching through binoculars as over 200 B-17 seconds approached. His fighter wings threw everything at them. A coordinated assault by over 300 fighters that should have torn the bomber formations apart. The Germans shot down 60 bombers that day. It was their greatest victory of the air war. 60 American bombers destroyed, 600 American airmen dead or captured. But Klaus knew the truth that the propaganda wouldn't report. Germany had lost 38 fighters and their irreplaceable pilots. And more importantly, the Americans would have those 60 bombers replaced within 2 weeks. The Luftwaffe's losses would take months to replace, if they could be replaced at all. That night, Klaus made a decision. He would request a transfer to anywhere but air defense, because he couldn't watch anymore, couldn't bear to stand in his bunker and count the formations while pretending there was still hope. He found Lieutenant Fischer in the communications room, pale and exhausted after the day's battle. The young officer had been keeping his own tally of losses, and the numbers had begun to break his spirit. "Fischer," Klaus said quietly, "do you have family in the cities?" "My mother, in Hamburg Oberst." Hamburg. Klaus had seen the reports from Hamburg. The RAF had burned the entire city center in a firestorm that killed 40,000 people in a single night. Write to her. Tell her to leave. Go to the countryside. Don't sign the letter, make it anonymous if you have to. But get her out. Fisher's eyes widened. Sir, I could be arrested for...
I know what it is. Klaus put a hand on the young man's shoulder. But in 6 months, maybe less, there won't be any safe cities left. Save who you can, Lieutenant.
It's all we can do now. As Klaus walked back to his quarters through the October darkness, he could hear bombers in the distance, British raiders, heading for Kassel. The sound that had once sparked his warrior's pride now filled him only with exhaustion and grief. The war would continue. More cities would burn. More pilots would die. The formations would keep coming, until there was nothing left to defend. And Klaus Richter would remember that moment over Schweinfurt when he'd first seen the future written in the sky, and known that Germany was already defeated, killed not by courage or strategy, but by the simple, merciless arithmetic of industrial warfare. Klaus Richter had been transferred to Dresden 3 months earlier, ostensibly to oversee air raid preparations for one of Germany's few remaining undamaged cities. In reality, he suspected it was a quiet exile punishment for his increasingly vocal concerns about civilian evacuation procedures. Dresden was beautiful in winter, its Baroque architecture dusted with snow, the Elbe River frozen at its edges. The city had been largely spared the systematic destruction visited upon Hamburg, Berlin, and the Ruhr. Some called it the Florence of the Elbe. Others whispered that Churchill was preserving it as a gift for Stalin, since Soviet forces were now pushing westward through Poland. Klaus knew better. Dresden's turn would come. They always came. He stood in the city's antiquated air defense headquarters, a repurposed Baroque palace that was more architectural treasure than military installation, reviewing evacuation plans that he knew were woefully inadequate. Dresden had swollen with refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. The official population was 600,000. The real number was probably closer to 1 million. And they had shelters for perhaps a third of that. Oberst Richter? A young woman in civil defense uniform approached his desk. There are people here to see you. They say it's urgent. Klaus looked up to find a delegation of 3 civilians, 2 elderly men and a middle-aged woman, all wearing the worn clothing of the educated middle class, fallen on hard times. The woman spoke first. Herr Oberst, we represent a group of concerned citizens. We've heard. That is, there are rumors that you've been trying to improve evacuation procedures. She glanced nervously at the door. We want to help. We have access to rural properties where refugees could be sent. We could organize transportation if... Stop. Klaus raised his hand, his heart sinking. These were good people, trying to save lives. But they were also walking into a trap. What you're proposing could be considered defeatism. Creating unauthorized evacuation plans assumes the city will be bombed, which contradicts official statements that Dresden is safe. But you know it isn't safe, one of the old men said urgently. Everyone knows. We've seen what happened to Hamburg, to Berlin. Dresden will be next. And when it happens, I can't help you officially. Klaus cut him off, then lowered his voice. But if certain documents were accidentally left on this desk, and if copies somehow found their way to civilian organizations, I couldn't stop that, could I? He pulled out a folder containing his unauthorized evacuation maps and transportation schedules. Now please leave. For your own safety. They understood. The woman took the folder with trembling hands, and the 3 left. Quickly. Klaus knew he'd just committed a court-martial offense, at minimum, probably treason. But he'd stopped caring about regulations months ago. Somewhere between watching the firestorm over Hamburg and counting the child-sized bodies pulled from the rubble of Berlin. The bombers came on the night of the 13th of February 1945, not 1,944 as Klaus had feared, but a year later when Dresden had swollen even larger with refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army. By then, Klaus had spent more than a year running his unauthorized shadow evacuation network, quietly moving thousands of civilians to the countryside, despite official orders to maintain morale by keeping populations in place. He was in the headquarters bunker when the first wave arrived. Not the Americans this time, but the RAF British Lancasters coming in the darkness, carrying a new and terrible purpose. The first attack lasted 25 minutes. When it ended, Dresden's historic center was burning. But this wasn't the end, it was just the preparation. The British had learned from Hamburg. The first wave had been incendiaries, designed to start thousands of small fires. Now they would wait 3 hours for those fires to merge and grow, for the fire trucks to commit to fighting them, for rescue workers to flood into the city center. Then they would come back and bomb the rescuers. Oberst, we're getting reports of firestorm conditions developing. The meteorological officer reported, his voice shaking. Wind speeds in the city center exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. Klaus had studied the Hamburg reports. He knew what was coming. The fires were creating their own weather system now. A thermal column so powerful it was pulling in air from all directions, feeding itself, growing hotter and larger with every minute. The temperature in the city center would soon exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass, to ignite stone, to turn human beings into ash in seconds. The second wave arrived exactly 3 hours later. 700 more bombers, dropping high explosives on a city that was already dying. Then, at dawn, the Americans came over 300 B-17 seconds in daylight to finish what the British had started. When it was over, Klaus emerged from the bunker into a world that had ceased to exist. Dresden, the Florence of the Elbe, was gone. Not damaged, gone. Where Baroque palaces had stood, there was only rubble and ash. Where 1 million people had lived, there were firestorm winds still hot enough to sear exposed skin. The body count would be debated for decades. 25,000, said the careful post-war studies. 135,000, claimed others. Klaus, walking through the ruins, thought the number didn't matter. What mattered was that an entire city, a city full of refugees, civilians, prisoners of war, and wounded soldiers who couldn't fight anyone, had been systematically erased from existence. He found Lieutenant Fischer in what had been the communications center, staring at a wall that no longer connected to anything. The young officer's face was streaked with ash and tears. "My mother was here," Fischer said without looking up. "She came here from Hamburg. I told her Dresden was safe. I told her." His voice broke. Klaus had no words. What could he say? That he'd tried to save people? That his unauthorized evacuations had moved perhaps 10,000 civilians to safety? Against 200,000 dead or missing, what did 10,000 matter? But then he thought of the woman who'd come to his office a year ago, and the folder she'd taken. He thought of the families he knew had escaped because of those accidentally leaked documents. 10,000 lives. Individual people with names and stories who would live and have children and grandchildren because of choices he'd made. It wasn't enough, but it was something. "Come with me," Klaus said, pulling Fischer to his feet. "We're going to the countryside. We're going to find survivors and get them away from this." He paused. "And then I'm going to write down everything I've seen. Not for the Reich, not for the Führer, but so that someday someone will know the truth about what happened here." Over the next weeks, Klaus worked with his shadow network to pull people from the ruins. Officially, he was coordinating air defense, though there was nothing left to defend. Unofficially, he was running an underground railroad, moving survivors to rural areas before the authorities could force them into labor battalions or worse. He saw things during those weeks that would never leave him. He saw a mother carrying the charred body of her child, refusing to put it down. He saw rescue workers who'd gone mad from what they'd found in the shelters. He saw an old man sitting in the rubble of his home, playing a violin with strings that kept breaking from the heat still radiating from the stones. And every day, he updated his hidden journal, documenting it all. By March 1945, the situation had deteriorated beyond comprehension. Berlin was being bombed daily. The Western Allies were across the Rhine. The Soviets were approaching Dresden's ruins. And still, the orders from above spoke of final victory, of wonder weapons, of the enemy's imminent collapse. Klaus was in a rural command post outside Dresden when General Major Hoffmann appeared, looking 20 years older than their last meeting. The old man had a bottle of real schnapps, a treasure beyond price, and 2 glasses. "The war will be over in weeks," Hoffmann said without preamble, pouring drinks. "Maybe days. The Führer is in Berlin, raging at generals and moving armies that no longer exist. The end is coming." "Good," Klaus said, and meant it. Hoffmann studied him. "You've changed. You used to be a good soldier." "I'm still a good soldier. That's why I couldn't keep following evil orders." Klaus drank his schnapps in one swallow. "I've spent the last year saving who I could, documenting what I've seen, and preparing for whatever tribunal comes after. I won't run. I won't hide behind just following orders. But I won't pretend this was anything other than what it was." And what was it? The death of everything we thought we were defending. We told ourselves we were protecting Germany. Instead, we stayed loyal to men who destroyed Germany more thoroughly than any enemy could have. Klaus set down his glass. "I watched hundreds of bombers blacken the sky over Schweinfurt in 1943. And I knew then we'd lost. But we kept fighting anyway. And the price of those extra 2 years was Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, hundreds of cities, millions of dead. And for what?" Hoffmann had no answer. There was no answer. In April, as Soviet shells began falling on Berlin, Klaus received orders to report to the capital for reassignment. He knew what that meant: a last stand, a pointless death in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, serving men who'd led Germany to absolute destruction. He tore up the orders. Instead, he gathered his journal, his maps, his documentation of everything he'd witnessed. He found Fischer, who'd been working beside him all these months. And together, they began moving west, toward the American lines, not to escape justice, but to ensure that their testimony would survive. "Do you think they'll believe us?" Fischer asked as they trudged through the spring mud, refugees in their own country. Klaus thought of the sky over Schweinfurt, black with bombers. He thought of Dresden burning. He thought of all the people he'd saved and all the ones he couldn't. "I think the truth is the truth," he said finally. "Whether they believe it or not, someone has to tell it." Klaus Richter and Lieutenant Fischer walked into the American checkpoint with their hands raised, Klaus's journal wrapped in oilcloth and tucked under his arm. They'd been moving west for 3 weeks, through a Germany that had ceased to exist as a nation and become instead a landscape of refugees, deserters, and the hollow-eyed survivors of a civilization's collapse. The American soldiers, young men who looked impossibly well-fed and equipped, raised their rifles with professional caution. An officer approached, a captain with the weary competence of someone who'd seen too much combat. "Sprechen Sie English?" the captain asked. "Yes," Klaus replied, in accented but clear English. "I am Oberst Klaus Richter, Luftwaffe Air Defense Coordinator. This is Lieutenant Fischer. We are surrendering voluntarily, and we have testimony to give." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Testimony?" Klaus held out the journal. "I have documented everything. The bombing campaigns from our perspective, evacuation failures, civilian casualties. Everything your intelligence officers will want to know." He paused. "And everything that history will need to know." They were separated for interrogation standard procedure. Klaus found himself in a commandeered schoolhouse, sitting across a desk from an American intelligence officer named Major Patterson. The major was perhaps 35, with the sharp eyes of someone trained to detect lies. "You're a senior Luftwaffe officer, voluntarily surrendering with documentation," Patterson said, leafing through Klaus's journal. "Forgive me for being suspicious about your motives." "I'm not seeking leniency," Klaus said. "I'm seeking an accurate record. I watched your bombers destroy Germany. I need someone to understand what that meant, not as propaganda for either side, but as truth. Patterson studied him for a long moment. Tell me about Schweinfurt. August 1943. And Klaus told him everything. The moment when he'd first counted the formations and known the war was lost. The mathematics that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. The slow, grinding certainty of defeat that came from watching American industrial might translate it into airborne devastation. He talked for hours. Patterson took notes, occasionally asking sharp questions that proved he was no fool. When Klaus described his unauthorized evacuation network, Patterson's expression flickered with something that might have been respect. You saved civilians while your own government ordered you to keep them in the cities, Patterson said. Why? Because I'm a soldier, not a murderer. Klaus met his eyes. When I realized we couldn't win, staying loyal to the regime meant staying loyal to men who would destroy Germany completely rather than admit defeat. At some point, duty to your country has to mean something more than following orders. Over the next days, Klaus was interviewed by a succession of officers, each more senior than the last. His journal was photographed, translated, cross-referenced with other intelligence. Fischer was brought in to corroborate the details of their evacuation network. On the fifth day, they brought in someone different. A lieutenant colonel with the bearing of an academic, who introduced himself as attached to the Strategic Bombing Survey. Oberst Richter, we're trying to assess the effectiveness of the bombing campaign, the colonel said. From your perspective, when did Germany lose the capacity to continue the war? Klaus considered the question carefully. In terms of industrial capacity? Probably mid-1944, when oil production collapsed and we could no longer adequately train pilots or fuel our fighters. In terms of morale, that varied. But the moment I personally knew we'd lost truly knew was the 17th of August 1943. The first time I saw your heavy bombers in force over Schweinfurt. Why that moment specifically? Because of what those formations represented. Not just bombs or destruction, but a level of industrial organization and production that we could never match. Each bomber required thousands of man-hours to build. Each bomber crew required months of training. Each mission required fuel, ordnance, spare parts, all produced in quantities we couldn't imagine. Klaus leaned forward. You didn't defeat us with tactics or courage, though your men had plenty of both. You defeated us with factories, with oil refineries, with training schools that graduated pilots faster than we could shoot them down. The colonel made notes. And the civilian impact? From your documentation, it seems you were deeply concerned about civilian casualties. I was concerned about unnecessary death, Klaus corrected. Your bombers killed perhaps 600,000 German civilians over the course of the war. That's 600,000 individual tragedies. But our government killed 12 million in camps and occupied territories. The Wehrmacht killed millions more in the Soviet Union. In the final accounting, Germany's leaders killed far more Germans through stubbornness, fanaticism, and refusal to admit defeat than your bombs ever did. The colonel studied him. That's a remarkable admission from a German officer. It's not an admission, it's arithmetic. Klaus pulled out a page from his notes. I calculated this during my last months in Dresden. If Germany had surrendered after Stalingrad when any rational assessment showed we couldn't win, we might have lost 2 million dead in some territory. By fighting to absolute destruction, we lost 8 million dead, every major city destroyed, the country divided, and our honor shattered beyond redemption. That wasn't your doing. That was ours. In June, as the occupation solidified and the full horror of the concentration camps became undeniable, Klaus was brought before a War Crimes Investigation Board. They'd found his name on documents authorizing air defense measures that had resulted in civilian casualties among Allied bombing crews who'd been forced down. Klaus didn't deny anything. I followed the laws of war as I understood them. I authorized anti-aircraft fire against military targets. Bomber crews were combatants. If I committed crimes in that regard, then so did every officer on both sides who ordered fire against enemy aircraft. But then they showed him documents from 1942 from before his transfer to air defense when he'd been stationed in Poland. Requisition orders with his signature, transportation manifests. Nothing directly incriminating, but part of the machinery that had enabled atrocities. "I signed routine paperwork," Klaus said, his voice hollow. "I didn't ask what it was for. I didn't want to know." He looked at the investigators. "That's my real crime. Not the bombing campaigns, not the air defense, but the willful blindness in the early years, when stopping it might have mattered." The investigation continued for months. Klaus was held in a detention facility with other German officers, some defiant, some broken, most simply exhausted. He spent his time writing an expanded version of his testimony, adding context and analysis to his wartime observations. Fischer, whose only crimes had been following orders to coordinate communications, was released in September. Before he left, he came to see Klaus one final time. "They're letting me go home," Fischer said. "Or what's left of home. My mother is gone. My city is rubble. But I'm free." He paused. "What will happen to you?" "I don't know," Klaus said honestly. "But I'm ready for whatever comes. I did terrible things by not questioning evil orders. I did good things by saving who I could. The balance." He shrugged. "History will judge." In December 1945, Klaus was formally cleared of war crimes but required to remain available for ongoing testimony. He was released from detention and found himself, at age 44, in a Germany that had been carved into occupation zones, its cities in ruins, its people starving and traumatized. He made his way to Bavaria, to the farm where he'd sent his wife and daughter in 1943. They'd survived his letter had reached them, and they'd left Berlin just weeks before the final Soviet assault. His daughter was 12 now, barely recognizable from the little girl he'd last seen 2 years ago. That first night, sitting at his in-laws' table eating thin soup and hard bread, his daughter asked the question he'd been dreading. "Father, did you do bad things in the war?" Klaus looked at his wife, then back at his daughter. He wouldn't lie. Not anymore. "Yes," he said. "I followed orders I should have questioned. I stayed loyal too long to people who didn't deserve loyalty. And many people died because good men like me didn't stop bad men when we had the chance. Did you do good things too?" "I tried. At the end, I saved who I could. I documented what I saw so that people would know the truth. And I accepted that I would have to answer for all of it, the good and the bad." His daughter considered this seriously. "Will they punish you?" "Maybe. But the real punishment is knowing what I could have done differently. And didn't." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand something. Duty and honor are worthless if they're given to evil causes. If someone orders you to do something wrong, even if they're in authority, even if refusing is dangerous, you have to refuse." That's the lesson of what happened here. Over the following years, Klaus testified at multiple tribunals, not as a defendant, but as a witness. His detailed documentation of the air defense campaign proved invaluable to historians and investigators alike. His journal was eventually published, heavily redacted, as part of the Strategic Bombing Survey's assessment of the air war. He never returned to military service. Instead, he became a teacher, working in the reconstruction of Germany's educational system. He taught history, and when his students asked about the war, he told them the truth, not the comfortable myths that were already forming, but the hard reality of what happens when good people follow evil orders. In 1963, on the 20th anniversary of the Schweinfurt raid, Klaus was interviewed by a German newspaper. The reporter asked if he'd do anything differently. "Everything," Klaus replied. "I would have questioned orders sooner. I would have refused to participate in evil earlier. I would have saved more people, even if it meant my own destruction." He paused, looking out the window at a rebuilt Germany that bore little resemblance to the one he'd grown up in. "But I can't change the past. All I can do is tell the truth about it and hope that future generations learn from our catastrophic mistakes. The reporter asked one final question. When you saw those hundreds of B-17 seconds over Schweinfurt, and you knew Germany was doomed, what did you feel? Klaus was silent for a long moment, remembering that August morning. The perfect blue sky, the mechanical thunder, the dark wall of bombers blotting out the horizon, the certain knowledge that everything was ending. I felt, he said finally, the weight of every choice I'd made that led to that moment. Every order I'd followed without question. Every warning sign I'd ignored. Every compromise with evil I'd accepted because it seemed necessary or expedient. He looked at the reporter. Those bombers didn't just carry explosives. They carried the consequences of 1,000 small surrenders of conscience. They carried the bill for what happens when an entire nation decides that loyalty matters more than truth. And seeing them approach, knowing you couldn't stop them, was that when you decided to change? No, Klaus said. That was when I realized that all my previous decisions had made change impossible. The time to stop it was years before, when it would have cost me my career. By the time those bombers appeared, it was too late to stop anything. All I could do was bear witness, save who I could, and hope that my testimony might prevent someone, somewhere, from making the same mistakes. Klaus Richter died in 1979 at the age of 78. His expanded testimony, fully published after his death, became a foundational document for understanding the air war from the German perspective. His documentation of his unauthorized evacuation network was credited with saving an estimated 15,000 civilians, a number that could never be precisely verified, but represented thousands of individual lives that continued, had children, built new futures. At his funeral, his daughter, now a professor of history herself, spoke about her father's legacy. He was not a hero. He was complicit in great evil through his obedience. But when he finally understood the truth, he spent the rest of his life bearing witness to it. He taught us that courage isn't just about facing the enemy. It's about facing your own failures, admitting your complicity, and refusing to let comfortable lies replace difficult truths. He saw hundreds of bombers approaching and knew his nation was doomed. But more than that, he understood why it was doomed. Not because of enemy strength, but because of internal moral collapse. That knowledge didn't save Germany, but it did save him from becoming the kind of person who would spend the rest of his life denying responsibility and blaming others. That's his real legacy. Not the journal, not the testimony, not even the people he saved, but the example he set of how to live with your mistakes, how to speak truth even when it condemns you, and how to build something worthwhile on the ruins of catastrophic failure. The sky over Germany is clear now, free of bombers, free of war. But Klaus Richter's testimony remains a reminder of what happens when duty becomes blind obedience, when loyalty replaces conscience, and when good people follow evil orders, because questioning them seems too difficult, too dangerous, too costly. He stood on an observation platform on a perfect August morning and watched the future approaching in perfect formation. He couldn't stop it. And in the end, that witness, that refusal to let the truth be buried beneath convenient lies, may be the only victory possible after total defeat.